Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm Joe Firestone, your host, competing with the Democratic National Convention. And my topics for tonight are staring down Israel, also Kursk, revisionist Zionism, and Humphrey's ghost. And to be a little more specific than that, in this episode, we're going to discuss Pepe Escobar's view on how a BRICs trio is staring down Israel. Also, Pepe's view on the Kursk invasion and the Russian response to it. Also, we'll be going over Alastair Crooke's analysis of revisionist Zionism and its attempt at a new Nakba. And finally, we'll talk about how Humphrey's ghost may be haunting Harris's campaign. So let me check in with you guys before I go further. I see there are a few people here, but there are no comments. So I'm just going to proceed. More than a few people here. I'm just going to proceed with the first of our topics. And here's an article by Pepe Escobar called How a BRICs Trio is Standing Down Israel. Now, this one was done on August 15th, 2024. I've been holding on to it for a few days. It was originally published at the Cradle, as you can see from that graphic. And there's the trio, specifically the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese. Pretty powerful trio taken together. The global majority, says Pepe, is fully aware that the genocidals in Tel Aviv are trying as hard as they can to provoke an apocalyptic war with full U.S. military support, of course. And when I say this, I'm looking over at Bonnie, who's frowning at me. So, contrast that combative mindset with 25 years of Persian diplomacy. Iran's acting foreign minister, Ali Bajiri Kani, has recently remarked how Tehran is trying hard to prevent, quote, the Israeli regime's dream, quote unquote, of triggering an all-out regional war. Excuse me. But one should never interrupt the enemy when he is in total panic. Sun Tzu would have approved this maxim. Iran certainly won't interfere as the U.S. and G7 members pull out all the stops to come up with some semblance of a Gaza ceasefire deal between Hamas and Israel to prevent a serious military retaliation by Iran in the axis of resistance. Earlier this week, that warning bore fruit. Hamas representative in Lebanon, Ahmed Abdel Hadi, reported yesterday that Hamas will not show up at the tentative negotiation round on Thursday. That was last Thursday. Today, it was in the article. The reason the clear climate is full of deceit and procrastination from Netanyahu, playing for time while the Axis prepares a response to the assassination of martyrs, specifically Hamas Politburo chief Ismail Haniyeh and Hezbollah military commander Fuad Shukur. Hamas will not enter into negotiations that provide cover for Netanyahu and his extremist government. So, the waiting game, actually a masterclass of strategic ambiguity to rattle Israel's nerves, will persist. Beneath all the cheap drama of the collective West begging Iran to not respond, there is a void. Nothing is offered in return. Worse, Washington's European vassals, the UK, France, and Germany, issued a statement straight out of Desperation Row where they, quote, call on Iran and its allies to refrain from attacks that would further escalate regional tensions and jeopardize the opportunity to agree to a ceasefire and the release of hostages. They will bear responsibility for actions that jeopardize the opportunity for peace and stability. No country or nation stands to gain from a further escalation in the Middle East, unquote. Predictably, not a single word about Israel. In this neo-Orwellian formulation, it's as if the recorded history of the planet started when Iran announced it would retaliate for the assassinations of Haniyeh in Tehran. Iranian diplomacy swiftly replied to the vassals, stressing its, quote, recognized right, unquote, to defend national sovereignty and create deterrence against Israel, the real source of terrorism in West Asia. Of course, this statement by Pepe is completely correct. And crucially, going on with the article, emphasizing they, quote, do not seek permission from anyone to exercise it being their right, of course. So, the heart of the matter predictably escapes Western logic. If Washington had forced the Gaza ceasefire last year, the risk of an apocalyptic war convulsing West Asia would have been avoided. And I have to add, of course, Washington could have forced the Gaza ceasefire any moment after October 7th. It only had to say, we're not shipping you any arms for any more killing, in Gaza. I suppose Washington probably could have waited about a week or two, to give the Israelis some opportunity to retaliate for the attack. But then they could have and should have said, no more arms until and unless there's a peace settlement with the Arabs once and for all in Palestine. That would have been statesmanship. That would have been what the United States should have done. Going on with the article. Instead, the U.S. on Wednesday approved a further $20 billion weapons package to Tel Aviv, showing exactly how committed the Americans are to securing a permanent ceasefire. Of course, that was exactly the wrong thing. It was more insanity piled on top of insanity. That, again, is me editorializing. Palestine meets the BRICs. The Israeli provocations especially the assassination of Hania, were a direct affront to three top BRICS members: Iran, Russia, and China. So the response to Israel implies a concerted articulation of the trio, deriving from its interlocked, comprehensive strategic partnerships. Earlier on Monday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi took a crucial phone call from Iranian acting Foreign Minister Ali Bagheri Khani, during which he adamantly supported all of Tehran's efforts to ensure regional peace and stability. It also signals Chinese support for an Iranian reaction to Israel, especially considering that the assassination of Hania was seen in Beijing as an unforgivable slap to its considerable diplomatic efforts, taking place only a few days after the Hamas chief, alongside other Palestinian political representatives, signed the Beijing Declaration. That was the declaration that the various Palestinian factions were going to stick together and present a united front against Israel. Then on Tuesday, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, also known in some circles as Abu Mazen, met with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, at his Novo-Ogaryovo residence in Moscow. What Putin said to Abbas is a gem of an understatement. Quote, "It is well known that Russia today, unfortunately, must defend its interests, defend its people with weapons in its hands. But what is happening in the Middle East, that is in West Asia, what is happening in Palestine, certainly does not go unnoticed. Yet there is a serious problem. The U.S. and Israeli-backed Abbas is like some sort of broken reed, enjoying scarce credibility in Palestine, with the latest polls revealing that 94% of West Bankers and 83% of Gazans demand his resignation. Meanwhile, less than 8% of Palestinians blame Hamas as responsible for their current horrible plight. Overwhelming trust is placed in the new Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar. Moscow is in a complex position, trying to boost a new political process in Palestine with its instrumental tools of statesmanship in a much more forceful way than the Chinese. Yet, Abbas is resisting it. There are some auspicious angles, though. In Moscow, Abbas said that they had discussed BRICs. Quote, "We have reached a verbal agreement that Palestine would be invited in the, quote, outreach, unquote, format, unquote, and expressed hope that, quote, a particular format of a meeting could be organized and it will be devoted exclusively to Palestine so that all countries would voice their views on the developments that are taking place. It will all be as relevant as possible, considering the fact that the countries of this association, BRICs, are all friendly to Palestine," unquote. That in itself is a significant Russian diplomatic victory. The optics of Palestine being placed among the BRICs for serious discussions will have an immense impact all across Muslim states and the global majority. How to calibrate a deadly response. On the bigger picture, the axis of resistance response to Israel, Russia is also deeply involved. Recently, a stream of Russian aircraft landed in Iran, reportedly carrying offensive and defensive military hardware, including the game-changing Murmansk BN system, capable of jamming and scrambling all sorts of radio signals, GPS communication satellites, and electronic systems up to 5,000 kilometers away. This is the ultimate nightmare for Israel and its NATO helpers. If deployed by Iran, the Murmansk BN electronic warfare system can literally fry the whole Israeli grid, which is only 2,000 kilometers away, targeting military bases and also the electric grid. If Iran's response intends to really go off the charts, teaching the occupation state an epic, unforgettable lesson, that might feature a combination of the Murmansk BN and new Iranian hypersonic missiles. Boy, that sounds like, and this is a comment of mine, it would really cripple the capability of Israel to retaliate against such an attack. I mean, with its whole electrical grid fried, what's it going to do? I mean, its local backups had better be pretty good, but how are they going to communicate? And perhaps some extra Russian hypersonic surprises. After all, I'm going on with the article now. After all, Secretary of the National Security Council Sergei Shoigu recently went to Tehran to meet with Iranian Chief of Staff Major General Bajiri, exactly to round up the finer points of their comprehensive strategic partnership, including in the military field. Major General Bajiri even let the BRICs cat out of the bag when he said, quote, "We will welcome the tripartite cooperation of Iran, Russia, and China," unquote. That's how civilization states unite in practice to combat the forever war ethos built into the Western, quote, democratic, unquote, plutocracy. Yes, it is a plutocracy here. As much as Russia and China are supporting Palestine and Iran on several levels, it's inevitable that the focus of the forever wars is now turned against all of them. An escalation is rampant across the board in Ukraine, Israel, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, plus color revolutions from Bangladesh, successful to Southeast Asia, which is aborted. Which brings us to the key drama in Tehran, how to carefully calibrate a response that will make Israel regretful, but not lead to bleeding wounds from Iran to Russia and China. The overarching clash between Eurasia and NATO-stan is inevitable. Putin himself revealed it in stark terms when he said, quote, "Any peace talks with Ukraine are impossible as long as it conducts strikes on civilian populations and threatens nuclear power plants," unquote. Same applies to Israel and Gaza. Quote, "Peace talks," unquote, or ceasefire negotiations are impossible. Well, Gaza and foreign nations such as Syria, Iraq, and Yemen are being shelled at will. There is only one way to deal with it. That is militarily, with smart force. Iran, in consultation with strategic partners Russia and China, may be trying to find a third way. Project Israel is practically shutting down its own economy to safeguard the occupation state from a deadly response by Iran and the axis of resistance. So Tehran may be pushing Sun Tzu to the limit, the waiting game, the psyops, the unbearable strategic ambiguity, forcing Israeli settlers to stew in their underground bunkers until the whole across-the-board coordinated strategy is in place to deliver, a killer blow. Now this, to start my commentary or to continue my commentary, this article is the best article I've seen in all the press on what is going on with the Iranian retaliation to the Israeli assassinations. This is what makes the most sense. Iran has been playing the waiting game, the psyops, the unbearable strategic ambiguity, as Pepe puts it, until the coordinated strategy is in place, okay, to deliver a killer blow. And meanwhile, the Israeli settlers and maybe the Israeli population more generally are stewing in their bunkers while Iran gets ready. And Iran, Russia, and China are getting ready until they can deliver, or until the head of the spear, specifically Iran, can deliver an overwhelming response which does not allow, okay, a retaliation. Based on this article, it looks like a killer blow is coming, and it looks like it will have implications and consequences for all of Western Asia. It looks like it's going to shut down a lot of electrical grids in a lot of nations. And it looks like there are going to be precision attacks on various key points, okay, in Israel, and perhaps on the Israeli settlers themselves. That's the first of our pieces for tonight. Oh, this is ridiculous. I have one, Darren Fonzu, who is making various kinds of comments. I don't think I'm going to answer any of these. Evelina Waves all I'll say about, okay, the Red Beret, Darren, is, okay, the Red Beret is for Medicare for all. And you would know that if you weren't so effing ignorant. Evelina says, can we say the Iranians have learned to use the West ways against them? I don't know if they're using the West ways. They seem to be using more intelligent ways than the West ways. And Dee is here and says hello at 9:25. There are altogether 31 people here, which is a nice showing for today. So I am going to move on to my second set of comments, or I should say to my second article, which is another article by Pepe Escobar. And that has to deal with, so what really happened in Kursk? This one was done on August 16, 2024. And again, it's from the UN's review. I don't think it was originally there, but let's see who originally published it. Oh, the Strategic Culture Foundation originally published it. Now, this is a photo of tanks rolling down a road somewhere, maybe in Kursk. An extremely serious debate, says Pepe, is already raging among selected circles of power/intelligence in Moscow, and the heart of the matter could not be more incandescent. To cut to the chase, what really happened in Kursk? Was the Russian Ministry of Defense caught napping? Or did they see it coming and profited to set up a deadly trap for Kyiv? Well-informed players willing to share food nuggets on conditions of anonymity all stress the extreme sensitivity of it all. And Intel Pro, though, has offered what may be interpreted as a precious clue. Quote, "It is rather surprising to see such a concentration of force was unnoticed by satellite and drone surveillance at Kursk. But I would rather not exaggerate its importance," unquote. Another Intel Pro prefers to stress that, quote, "the foreign intel section is weak as it was very badly run," unquote. This is a direct reference to the state of affairs after former security overseer Nikolai Yoda, quote unquote, Patrushev, during Putin's post-inauguration reshuffle, was transferred from his post as Secretary of the Security Council to serve as a special presidential aide. The sources cautiously seem to converge on a very serious policy. Quote, "This very serious possibility," quote, "there seems to have been a breakdown in intel. They do not seem to have noticed the accumulation of troops at the Kursk border." Another analyst, though, has offered a way more specific scenario, according to which a hawkish military faction spread across the Ministry of Defense and the intel apparatus and antagonistic to the new Minister of Defense, specifically Belosov, an economist, let the Ukrainian invasion proceed with two objectives in mind: set a trap for Kyiv's top enemy commanders and troops who were diverted from the collapsing Donbass front, and put extra pressure on Putin to finally go for the head of the snake and finish off the war. This hawkish faction, incidentally, regards Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov as, quote, "totally incompetent," unquote. In the words of one Intel Pro, "There's no smoking gun, but Gerasimov allegedly ignored several warnings about a Ukrainian buildup near the Kursk border." A retired Intel Pro is even more controversial. He complains that, quote, "traitors of Russia," unquote, actually, quote, "stripped 3 regions from troops to surrender them to the Ukrainians," unquote. Now these, quote, "traitors of Russia," unquote, will be able to, quote, again, exchange, unquote, the city of Suja for leaving the fake country of Ukraine and promote it as an inevitable solution, unquote. Incidentally, only this Thursday, Belosov started chairing a series of meetings to improve security in the 3 regions, quote unquote, Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk. Hawks in the Siloviki apparatus don't make it a secret that Gerasimov should be fired and replaced by fabled General Sergei, quote, Armageddon, unquote, Surovikin. They also enthusiastically support the FSB's Alexander Bortnikov, who de facto solved the extremely murky Prigozhin affair as the man now really supervising the big picture in Kursk. Next one is Belgorod. Well, it's complicated. President Putin's reaction to the Kursk invasion was visible in his body language. He was furious for the flagrant military intel failure, for the obvious loss of face, and for the fact this buries any possibility of rational dialogue about ending the war. Yet he managed to turn the upset around in no time by designating Kursk as a counter-terrorist operation supervised by the FSB's Bortnikov and with an inbuilt, quote, take no prisoners, unquote, rationale. Every Ukrainian in Kursk not willing to surrender is a potential target set for elimination, now or later, no matter how long it takes. Bortnikov is the hands-on specialist. Then there's the overseer of the whole military-civilian operation, specifically Alexei Dayumin, the new secretary of the State Council, who, among other previous posts, was the deputy head of the Special Operations Division of GRU, that's the Military Intel Bureau. But Dayumin does not respond directly to the Ministry of Defense, nor the FSB. He is reporting directly to the president. Translation: Gerasimov now seems to be at best a figurehead in the whole Kursk drama. The men in charge are Bortnikov and Dayumin. Interesting. The Kursk PR gambit is set to massively fail. Essentially, the Ukrainian forces are moving away from their lines of communications and supplies into Russian territory. Okay, parallel can be made to what happened to Field Marshal von Paulus at Stalingrad when the German army became overextended. The Russians are already in the process of cutting off the Ukrainians in Kursk, breaking off their lines of supply. What's left of the crack soldiers launched into Kursk would have to turn back, facing Russians both at their front and back. Disaster looms. Irrepressible commander of the Akhmat Special Forces, Major General Apti Aladinov, the friend of Scott Ritter, by the way, confirmed on Rossiya 1 TV that at least 12,000 Ukrainian armed forces, that is UAF, entered Kursk, including a lot of foreigners, Brits, French, Poles. That will turn out to be, quote, take no prisoners, unquote, on a massive scale. Anyone with an IQ above room temperature knows Kursk is a NATO operation, conceived with a high degree of probability by an Anglo-Saxon combo supervising the Ukrainazi, I love that one, cannon fodder. Anything Kiev does depends on American ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And NATO weapon systems, of course, operated by NATO personnel. Okay. Also, Mikhail Podolyak, advisor to the sweaty green T-shirt actor in Kiev, admitted that Kiev, quote, discussed, unquote, the attack, quote, with Western partners, unquote, the, quote, Western partners, unquote, Washington, London, Berlin, in full cowardly regalia, but deny it. Bortnikov won't be fooled. He succinctly stated on the record that this was a Kiev terrorist attack supported by the West. We are now entering the stage of hardcore positioning combat bound to destroy villages and towns. It will be ugly. Russian military analysts remarked that if a buffer zone had been preserved way back in March 2022, mid-range artillery activity would have been restricted to Ukrainian territory. Yet another controversial decision by the Russian General Staff. Russia will eventually solve the Kursk drama, mopping up small Ukrainian groups in a methodically lethal way, yet very sensitive questions about how it happened and let it happen simply won't vanish. Heads will have to figuratively roll, because this is just the beginning. The next incursion will be, in Belgorod. Get ready for more blood on the tracks. Well, that's very interesting as a military analysis and also as a prediction of what's to come, and also a lot of information about the behind-the-scenes stuff going on inside of Russia. Very, very valuable blog that everybody in the West should be reading, if only to inform themselves on what is happening right now and what is likely to happen as we move further forward. 2 brilliant blog posts by Pepe Escobar. Now, moving to our next piece. Let me go to comments first before I get to our next piece. Robert Copeland says this article is a bunch of crap. I see I have 2 folks who don't like what I have to say here. Okay. We'll see what happens, Robert. We'll see what happens. We'll see if the Russians mop up in Kursk, and we'll see if the other predictions of Pepe turn out to be true. We shall see. Meanwhile, I think both articles were brilliant. Let me go to a third brilliant piece. This one is by Alastair Crooke. The name of it is Revisionist Zionists Dare the U.S. to Pull the Plug on Their Nakba Agenda. This is a particularly long one. It was written on August 19, 2024. It's a 2,000-word article, so it's twice as long as the last one by Pepe. I'll take a drink before I start. Israelis have been deeply divided these last years. Unable to coalesce around the government, after 5 general elections, they decided to dismiss the Lapid-Gantz team and to put a new coalition formed around Netanyahu and small Jewish supremacist parties into power. However, soon after the formation of the new government, there occurred a severe outbreak of, quote, buyer's remorse, unquote, with a substantial segment of Israelis seemingly ready to contemplate almost anything to oust their government. Demonstrations have occurred regularly throughout Israel to prevent the country from becoming, in the words of one former Mossad director, unquote, a racist and violent state that cannot survive, unquote. But it is probably already too late. Most people outside Israel tend to lump together different and often opposing views in Israel solely through the reductive perspective of seeing all these diverse actors as being Jews and Zionists of slightly differing hues. They couldn't be more wrong. There is an existential divide. There are diverse forms of Zionism. The divisions go to the very meaning of what it means to be a Jew. Benjamin Netanyahu is a, quote, revisionist Zionist, unquote, i.e. a follower of Vladimir Jabotinsky, for whom his father, Benzion Netanyahu, served as private secretary. Quote, revisionist Zionism is the polar opposite to the cultural Zionism of the World Jewish Congress, the WJC. As a young man, Netanyahu professed that Palestine is, quote, a land without a people for a people without a land, unquote. He was consequently in favor of expelling all Arab, quote, blow-ins, unquote, as he saw them. Furthermore, he advocated the idea that the state of Israel extends from the Nile to the Euphrates. However, during his 16 years as prime minister, Netanyahu was perceived as having moderated, become more pragmatic, but still devious. With hindsight, maybe he similarly adapted to the times. Well, possibly he was practicing Straussian, quote, double truth, unquote. The practice which Leo Strauss taught his followers as the only means of preserving, quote, true, unquote, Judaism without encompassing, quote, liberal European, unquote, largely Ashkenazi ethos. Strauss, quote, esotericism, unquote, drawn from Moses Maimonides, the early Jewish mystic. Actually, if I recall my history correctly, not that early, something like, I can't remember whether it was the 11th or the 12th centuries, was one of outwardly professing a, quote, worldly thing, whilst inwardly preserving a completely contrasting esoteric reading of the world. Just to be clear, revisionist Zionists, of which Netanyahu is one, okay, include Begin, specifically Menachem Begin, and Ariel Sharon, who demonstrated that of which they were capable with the Nakba, the mass expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. Netanyahu is of this line, quote unquote, and SCO is a key dominant faction in Washington. The, quote, war, unquote, with Washington post 7th of October. At first, Washington reacted with unreflective and immediate support for Israel, vetoing various UN Security Council ceasefire resolutions and fully provisioning Israel's military needs for the destruction of the Palestinian enclave in Gaza. It was unthinkable in the U.S. establishment eyes to do anything other than support Israel. Israel's qualitative military edge, QME, is enshrined as being one of the foundational structures supporting the brittle branch on which U.S. hegemony rests. Ordinary Americans, and some in the administration, however, were watching the horrors of genocide, quote, live, unquote, on their cell phones. The Democratic Party started to fracture badly. The, quote, power brokers, unquote, in the back room began to put pressure on the Israeli war cabinet to negotiate the release of the hostages and conclude a ceasefire in Gaza. hoping for a return to the status quo ante. But Netanyahu's government in various tautological ways said no, quote unquote, unashamedly playing on the 7th of October trauma of its citizens to assert the need to destroy Hamas. Washington somewhat belatedly came to understand that the 7th of October was now the pretext for Jabotinsky's followers to do what they had always wanted to do, to expel the Palestinians from Palestine. The Israeli message was perfectly, quote, received and understood by Washington's ruling strata, the revisionist Zionists, who represent about 2 million Israelis, intended cynically to impose their will on the Anglo-Saxons and also impose their will on the other 5 million Israelis, I should add, to impose their will on the Anglo-Saxons, to threaten them with igniting war with the world in which the U.S. would burn, quote unquote. They would not hesitate to plunge the U.S. into a wide regional war should the White House try to undercut the neo-Nakba project. In spite of the absolute support Israel has across Washington, it seems that the ruling class decided that the, quote, revision stratagem, unquote, ultimatum could not be tolerated. A crucial U.S. election was in train. U.S. soft power around the world was collapsing. Anyone around the globe watching events unfold understood that killing 40,000 plus innocent people had nothing to do with eliminating Hamas. Understanding the background. I suppose I should comment here and refer to the estimate by the Lancet that the fatalities have been as high as 186,000 people. Understanding the background, to understand the nature of this occult war between the revisionist Zionists and Washington, it is necessary to revisit Leo Strauss, a German Jew who had left Germany in 1932 under the auspices of a Rockefeller Foundation grant, finally to arrive in the United States in 1938. And by the way, once he arrived in the United States, he went to the University of Chicago as a full professor and began to teach his version of political philosophy to generations of students moving through the University of Chicago. Many of those students found their way into government roles, in foreign policy, and they imbibed the idea of the Platonic double truth that Leo Strauss, was teaching, the idea of the noble I that was taught, by Plato and taken up, by Leo Strauss. The point here is that the ideas at play in this, going on with the article, in this ideological struggle, are not just about Israelis and Palestinians. They are about control and power. I guess I should add at this point before I go further. Those people who were students of Strauss and who moved into the government later became essential to the neocon movement in foreign policy. Unless we think that there was something evil about the University of Chicago, while they were educating, the neocons, they were also educating people who believed in the realist school of foreign policy, the leading practitioner of which these days is Professor Mearsheimer, a wonderful practitioner of the school of realism, who has greatly transcended the chief exponent of realism in the 1940s and 50s, specifically Professor Morgenthau, who was also at the University of Chicago. Going on. The point here is that the ideas at play in this ideological struggle are not just about Israelis and Palestinians. They're about control and power. The essence of the present Israeli government's agenda, particularly its controversial legal reform, are pure Leo Strauss derivatives. They are, and it was very perceptive of Alastair Crooke to see this. The concern among the U.S. rulers was that Netanyahu's agenda was becoming an exercise in pure Straussian power at the expense of secular American power. Yes, because, of course, Straussian believed strongly, in a religious approach, to politics. That is to say that the revisionist notions are shared by the influential group of Americans that formed about this professor of philosophy, Leo Strauss, at the University of Chicago. There are many accounts report that he had formed a small inner group of faithful Jewish students to whom he gave private oral instruction. The esoteric inner meaning to politics was centered, hearsay accounts, on asserting political hegemony as the means to guard against a new shoach. Shoach, of course, is the Hebrew term for Holocaust. The core of Strauss's thought, the theme to which he returned time and again, is what he called the curious polarity between Jerusalem and Athens. What did these two names signify? On the surface, it would seem that Jerusalem and Athens represent two fundamentally different, even antagonistic codes or ways of life. The Bible, Strauss held, presents itself not as philosophy or science, but as a code of law, an unchangeable divine law mandating how we should live. In fact, the first 5 books of the Bible are known in the Jewish tradition as the Torah. And Torah, quote unquote, is perhaps most literally translated as, quote, law, unquote. The attitude taught by the Bible is not one of self-reflection or critical examination, but of absolute obedience, faith, and trust in revelation. If the paradigmatic Athenian is Socrates, the paradigmatic biblical figure is Abraham, and the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, who was prepared to sacrifice his son for an unintelligible divine command. Quote, yes, unquote, Western liberal democracy brought civil equality, tolerance, and the end to the worst forms of persecution. Yet at the same time, the liberalism required of Judaism, as it does of all faiths, to undergo the privatization of belief, the transformation of Jewish law from a communal authority to the precincts of individual conscience. The result, as Strauss analyzed it, was a mixed blessing. The liberal principle of the separation of state and society, of public life and private belief, could not but result in the, quote, Protestantization of Judaism, quote, unquote, of Judaism, he suggested. To be clear, these two antagonistic ways of being express fundamentally different moral and political points of view. This is the essence of what divides the two camps, quote unquote, that inhabit Israel today. Democratic, quote, cultural Judaism, unquote, versus the Judaism of faith and obedience to divine revelation, setting the trap for the United States. The U.S. Straussians began forming a political group half a century ago in 1972, which, by the way, just to mention it, was the year that Joe Biden was elected to the Senate for the first time. They were all members of Democratic Senator Henry Scoop Jackson's staff and included Elliot Abrams, Richard Pearl, and David Wurmser. In 1996, this Straussian trio wrote a study for the new Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This report, the clean break strategy, advocated the elimination of Yasser Arafat. The elimination means the assassination, right? The annexation of the Palestinian territories, a war against Iraq, and the transfer of Palestinians there. Netanyahu was very much a member of this circle. The strategy was inspired not only by the political theories of Leo Strauss, but also by those of his friend, Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of Revisionist Zionism, to whom Netanyahu's father served as private secretary. I think this is just an amazing piece, okay, in terms of giving the historical and philosophical background of what has gone on, okay, in Israel today, and what is going on, there today, and how that relates to American foreign policy. One of the Straussians, not the original ones that were mentioned, but one of the latest Straussians, who was most impressed by the thinking of Leo Strauss, was Wolfowitz. That is Paul Wolfowitz, who was instrumental in the foreign policies of the United States, both in the 1990s and the 2000s. One of the leading advocates for the interventions in Iraq, which have been so damaging for the United States and for the Iraqis. But going on, for the avoidance of confusion, the American Straussians, today usually called neocons, quote unquote, are not in principle opposed to the Netanyahu's government's Nakba agenda. It was not Gazan suffering that exercised them. Rather, it was the threats by the revisionist Zionists to launch an attack on Iran and on Lebanon. For this war to be launched, the Israeli army for certain would not be able to defeat Hezbollah on its own. And for Israel to wage war in Iran would amount to certifiable madness. Thus, to save Israel, the U.S. undoubtedly would be forced to intervene. The balance of military power has shifted considerably towards Hezbollah and Iran since the Israeli-Lebanese War of 2006, and any war now would be a fraught and risky undertaking. Yet this was of the essence to the Israeli government's unspoken, quote, esoteric, unquote, inner agenda. Washington tries to push back, but finds itself checkmated. The only alternative for the U.S. would be to encourage a military coup in Tel Aviv. Already some senior officers and non-commissioned Israeli officers have come together to suggest this. In March 2024, General Benny Gantz was invited to Washington against the wishes of the Prime Minister. He did not, however, accept the invitation to overthrow the Prime Minister. He went to make sure that he could still save Israel and that his allies in the U.S. would not turn against the Israeli military cadre. This may seem odd, but that the reality is that the IDF feels undermined, even betrayed. The agreement struck at the outset of the government between Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir of Otzma Yehudit was the outlier to this anxiety. The governmental accord provided for Ben-Gvir to head an autonomous armed force in the West Bank. He was given charge not only of the National Police, but also the Border Police, which until then had been the responsibility of the Ministry of Defense. The accord also provided for the creation of a large-scale National Guard and a reinforced presence of reserve troops within the Border Police. Ben-Gvir is a Kahanist, meaning a disciple of Rabbi Meir Kahana, who demands the expulsion of Palestinian Arab citizens from Israel and the occupied territories and the establishment of a theocracy. And he makes little secret of wanting to use the border police to expel the Palestinian populations, be they Muslim or Christian. Ben-Gvir's official forces represent, as Benny Gantz noted, a, quote, private army, unquote. But that is the half of it, for he separately holds the allegiance of hundreds of thousands West Bank secular vigilantes, over whom the radical Rabbi Dov Lior and his coterie of radical Jabotinsky rabbi influences have control. The regular army fears these vigilantes, as we saw at SD Taman military base when Ben Gavir's when his militia vigilantes stormed the base to protect soldiers accused of raping Palestinian prisoners. The anxiety of the Israeli military echelon at the reality of this, quote, Jabotinsky army, unquote, is evidenced by former Prime Minister Ehud Barak's warning that, quote, under cover of the war, a governmental and constitutional putsch is now taking place in Israel without a shot being fired. If this putsch isn't stopped, it will turn Israel into a de facto dictatorship within weeks. Netanyahu and his government are assassinating democracy. The only way to prevent a dictatorship at such a late stage is by shutting down the country through large-scale, nonviolent civil disobedience 24/7 until this government falls. Israel has never faced such a serious and immediate internal threat to its existence and future as a free society, end quote. The IDF elite want a ceasefire hostage deal, primarily to, quote, stop Ben Gvir, unquote. Not because it resolves Israel's Palestinian issue, it doesn't. But Netanyahu's ultimatum is that if the Haniya assassination isn't sufficient to plunge the U.S. into the big war that will give him the great victory, he can always trigger a bigger provocation. Ben Gvir also controls the Temple Mount security. There is always the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa escalatory ladder available for climbing through threatening the destruction of Al-Aqsa Mosque. That means, America is trapped. The power brokers are unhappy, but impotent. And that's how Alastair Crooke, actually ends this. I don't think the power brokers, are unhappy, but impotent. I think they're unhappy, but gutless. They can stop the weapon shipments to Israel tomorrow. They should have done that shortly after October 7th. They can still do it. They must do it for the sake of civilization and for the sake of Israel, for the sake of the Palestinians too. They must do it now. Now. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not 6 months from now, but now. Wasn't that a wonderful article, though? Showing the real trends of thinking and the ins and outs. It was an absolutely brilliant piece by Alastair Crooke. So moving on, well, I'll check your comments first before I move on to the final piece of the evening. Oh, we have 44 people here now. We keep on growing. But the comments have pretty much stopped. And Darren says he's a retired old man, 57 years old. For doctors tired, to lie to me. You do not like me being retired at 57? I don't mind. I mean, I'm 85. I have no wish to retire. No. Lana says, please hit the like button. Okay. Thank you, Lana. I'm now moving into the final piece of the evening. There are 45 people here, which is certainly very nice. I think most of them are here on Twitter because I only have, I think, a handful of comments from Facebook. Yes, I have some from Evelina. Everything is from YouTube. And 95% of the comments are from Darren Fonzo and are non-relevant to this particular broadcast. They're just personal rants, of Darren Fonzo. Anyway, going to the final piece now. Let me once more share the screen. I picked this up at Los Angeles Progressive. I think it also appeared in Common Dreams at first. But even though I could have, I did not pick it up there. This is from Norman Solomon on August the 15th. He asked the question, is Hubert Humphrey's ghost stalking Kamala? As a pivotal election neared, a candidate had to decide whether to keep supporting an unpopular war or speak out for a meaningful change. Humphrey faced that choice in 1968. Harris faces it now. There is Senator Humphrey. I'm sorry, Vice President Humphrey. That was probably in 1968. After the Democrat in the White House decided not to run for re-election, the vice president got the party's presidential nod and continued to back the administration's policies for an unpopular war. As the election neared, the candidate had to decide whether to keep supporting the war or speak out for a change. Humphrey faced that choice in 1968. Kamala Harris faces it now. Despite the differences in eras and circumstances, key dynamics are eerily similar. The history of how Vice President Humphrey navigated the political terrain of the war in Vietnam has ominous parallels with how Vice President Harris has been dealing with the war, in Gaza. I should add here that Humphrey, until he joined the Johnson administration as the vice president after the assassination of John Kennedy, and Humphrey was selected as the vice president, which choice was ratified when he ran with Johnson in the election of 1964. Until then, Humphrey was the quintessential lefty of Democratic politics. People don't really remember that. He had been the mayor, of Minneapolis, and was considered an extreme radical as the mayor, of Minneapolis. And when he became a senator, he was considered probably the most radical person, in the U.S. Senate, for a number of years. A very reliable liberal vote, when to be a liberal meant to be left-wing, nearly a socialist here in the United States. Humphrey was a darling of the left. He ran for the presidency in 1960 and lost the primary, to JFK. But he ran to the left of JFK, considerably to the left of him, and had he been elected president, he would have been a much more lefty president than JFK. But he became the vice president so that left-wing support could be gotten for the Johnson administration in 1964. As the Vietnam War proceeded, it was clear that Humphrey didn't like what was going on, but he had to swallow everything. Johnson was such a powerful personality and was in such control of the party that if Humphrey wanted to succeed him in running in 1968, it would be very difficult for him to buck what Lyndon Johnson wanted him to say. Going on with the article, from landslide to chaos. For millions of liberals during the first half of the 1960s, Hubert Humphrey was the nation's most heroic politician. As the Senate Majority Whip, he deftly championed landmark bills for civil rights and social programs. By the time President Lyndon Johnson put him on a Democratic ticket in 1964, progressive momentum was in high gear. LBJ defeated ultra-conservative Barry Goldwater in a landslide, one of the great landslides in the history of American politics, I might add, only rivaled by the Nixon landslide of 1972 and by the Roosevelt landslide of 1936 and by the Reagan landslide of 1984. As vice president, Humphrey assisted Johnson to follow up the 1964 Civil Rights Act with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That is the act that has recently been gutted by this terrible Supreme Court, and a huge set of anti-poverty measures while enacting broad social programs in realms of education, healthcare, nutrition, housing, and the environment. Midway through the summer of 1965, Johnson signed the Medicare and Medicaid bills into law. All, of course, with the support, of Senator Humphrey. Why didn't they go further to Medicare for all? That was in the thinking then, that Medicare was only the first step and that they would move into full government support of health care. Why didn't they do it? Because of the escalation of the war in Vietnam and the pressure that was putting on the budget of the United States. We were not yet a fiat currency then. And pressure was being put on our gold standard by foreign nations as the 1960s wore on, in particular by France. That was converting the US dollars into gold at the international gold window that was still open. Going further with the article. Meanwhile, escalation of the US war on Vietnam was taking off. And as Martin Luther King Jr. soon pointed out, quote, when a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, social programs must inevitably suffer. We can talk about guns and butter all we want to, but when the guns are there with all of its emphasis, you don't even get good oleo. These are facts of life, unquote. Martin Luther King pointed that out, and in the context of those times, he was completely right. The drive towards universal health care through an expansion of Medicare was stopped by the Vietnam War. Most people don't even recognize that now. If not for the Vietnam War, if not for the escalation, if Johnson had withdrawn from Vietnam in 1965, which he should have done, what would have happened? Well, Vietnam, would have been taken over by the communists. So what? In 1974, they took over anyway. What was sacrificed by that? It was Medicare for all. We didn't even have that name for it then. But it was universal health care under a Medicare type of program. We could have had it when Canada had it between 1966 and 1972. And the Vietnam War stopped that. That's not in this article, but I'm adding all that. Going on. At first, Vice President Humphrey wrote slightly dovish memos to Johnson, who angrily rejected the advice and retaliated by excluding him from key meetings. Banished to the doghouse, Humphrey licked his wounds and changed his approach. By early 1966, he was deferring to Johnson's war views in private and advocating for the Vietnam War in public. As the war escalated, so did the vice president's zeal to extol it as a fight for freedom and democracy. Quote, by 1967, he had become a hawk on Vietnam. Biographer Arnold Offner noted, beneath the lofty rhetoric was cold calculation. Quote, Humphrey's passage from dove to hawk on Vietnam was not the result of one-sided White House briefings or of his ability, as one journalist had noted, to see silver linings in the stormiest clouds, unquote, Offner wrote. And quote again, his change of position derived from a case of willful mind over matter, from his strong anti-communism combined with political expediency driven by ambition, namely desire to remain in Johnson's good graces and perhaps succeed him whenever his presidency ended, unquote. That desire to be in the president's good graces did not dissipate after Johnson suddenly announced in televised address on March 31, 1968, that he would not seek a re-election. 4 weeks later, Humphrey launched a presidential campaign that pitted him against two anti-war candidates, Senators Eugene McCarthy and Robert F. Kennedy. From the outset, Eugene McCarthy, by the way, was the senator from Minnesota. One of the senators, from Minnesota. Anyway. From the outset, Humphrey was plagued by his fear of antagonizing Johnson if he were to depart from a pro-war script. The United States had, quote, nothing to apologize for, Humphrey said. He didn't run in any primaries and was not willing to debate McCarthy, or Kennedy. Humphrey mouthed the same old rhetoric to rationalize the administration's policies for the war in Vietnam. Guys, I was so angry at Humphrey during this period of time. So angry at him. In the 1968 election, I didn't do anything for Humphrey until the final days of the campaign. Then I finally gave a contribution to his campaign. At that point, I sat on my hands, for the whole election, which of course helped the Nixon victory in 1968. It was only a close victory, very close victory. I believe it was somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 votes that, if shifted, would have given Humphrey the presidency and would have resulted in a much quicker resolution of the Vietnam War, because Humphrey wanted to do it. Several high-level supporters, including Iowa's Governor Harold Hughes, Vermont's Governor Philip Hoff, and the venerable former New York Governor and Ambassador Averell Harriman, advised him to resign the vice presidency and thus free himself from entanglement with Johnson. But to Humphrey, such a step was unthinkable. And so, Hubert Humphrey rode in the caboose of the war train all summer. In late August, the day before the Democratic National Convention got underway in Chicago, he told viewers of the CBS program Face the Nation that the administration's policies in Vietnam were, quote, basically sound. If he had followed the advice of Averell Harriman, he would have been free to attack those policies. And the riots in Chicago, which were one factor in the Democrats' defeat in 1968, the riots would never have happened. The convention nominated him, while outside tear gas filled the air, during what a report from a special federal commission later called a police riot that meted out violence to anti-war demonstrators, as well as some journalists. Inside the turbulent convention, dissenting delegates were outshouted, outvoted, and suppressed by the pro-Humphrey forces. The chaos and bitterness in Chicago underscored how the vice president's deference to the war president weakened the party while undermining the chances for victories. In polls, Humphrey trailed the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, by double digits. And yet, like a true warhorse, the VP could not bring himself to break from the president's steely insistence on maintaining the U.S. government's horrific violence in Vietnam. The Democratic ticket of Humphrey and Maine Senator Edmund Muskie was in a tailspin, propelled downward by Humphrey's refusal to break ranks with Johnson. It wasn't until September 30th that Humphrey took a meaningful step. His campaign bought 30 minutes of national TV airtime on NBC, and he used it to deliver a speech that finally created a bit of daylight between him and Johnson's war. Humphrey said that as president, he'd be willing to halt the bombing of North Vietnam. The speech revived his campaign, which nearly closed the gap with Nixon in October. But it was too little, too late. And the next section is called Trying to Square a Circle of Mass Murder with the, quote, politics of joy. Oh, by the way, had Humphrey not stood with Johnson and run his own campaign, that would have been a politics of joy, because the way Humphrey ran campaigns, he was known as a happy warrior. That was his tradition. Going on with the article. Like Hubert Humphrey 6 decades ago, Kamala Harris has remained in step with the man responsible for changing her title from senator to vice president. She has towed President Biden's war line while at times voicing sympathy for the victims of the Gaza war that's made possible by policies that she supports. Her words of compassion have yet to translate into opposing the pipeline of weapons and ammunition to the Israeli military as it keeps slaughtering Palestinian civilians. As a Democratic standard bearer during carnage in Gaza, Harris has been trying to square a circle of mass murder, expressing empathy for victims while staying within the bounds of U.S. government policies. Last week, Harris had her national security advisor declare that, quote, she does not support an arms embargo on Israel, unquote. What a mistake that was. If maintained, that stance will continue to be a moral catastrophe, while increasing the chances that Harris will lose to Donald Trump. In effect, so far, Harris has opted to stay aligned with power brokers, big donors, and conventional political wisdom instead of aligning, with most of the voters. Now, there's one area where Harris has a big advantage over Humphrey. In Humphrey's situation, there was a split within the Democratic Party in 1968 because of the the Gene McCarthy campaigns and the Robert F. Kennedy campaigns. So there was a clear split, inside of the party. and in the context, of the election, because Nixon was hardline on Vietnam also. He wasn't soft, on Vietnam. He was hardline on it. Now, he later ran on, he would bring an end to it. He had some, sort of Eisenhowerian tactic in mind to try to claim that he could bring a quick end, to the Vietnam War. He didn't actually end it, of course, for another 6 years. But he made some claims, in the campaign. Those were credible because Humphrey stuck with Johnson for so long. In this campaign, Harris, though, has Trump being more to the right even, than Biden. So the alternative, in the general election as it's now shaping up, the campaign of Bobby Kennedy seems to be in tatters right now. The Jill Stein campaign is going forward, but has very little financial power, has good personnel, has a great platform, but has no financial power whatsoever. It looks increasingly, based on the polls, like this is a contest between Harris and Trump. And Harris has the advantage that Humphrey did not have, specifically that her Republican opponent is clearly to the right of where she is, and everybody can see it. He's clearly to the right, of where Joe Biden is. So that is an advantage. Maybe it gives Harris a little more time to change her tune. I don't know, though. Pressure is fantastic. In effect, so far, Harris has opted to stay aligned with power brokers, big donors, and conventional political wisdom instead of aligning with most voters. The CBS YouGov poll in June found that Americans oppose sending weapons and supplies to Israel by 61 to 39%. Last week, Harris described herself and running mate Tim Walz as, quote, joyful warriors, unquote. Many outlets have heralded their joyride along the campaign trail. The Associated Press reported that, quote, Harris is pushing joy, unquote. The New York Times headline proclaimed that, quote, joy is fueling her campaign, unquote. The brand of the Harris campaign is fast becoming, quote, the politics of joy. Such branding will be in sharp contrast to the outcries from thousands of protesters in Chicago outside the Democratic National Convention next week, which of course is this week, as they denounce U.S. complicity with the methodical killing of so many children, women, and other civilians in Gaza. Campaigning for joy while supporting horrendous warfare is nothing new. 56 years before Vice President Harris called herself a joyful warrior, Vice President Humphrey declared that he stood for the, quote, politics of joy, unquote, when announcing his run for the 1968 Democratic presidential nomination. At that point, the Pentagon was several years into its massive killing spree in Vietnam as Humphrey kicked off his campaign by saying, quote, here we are, the spirit of dedication. Here we are, the way the politics ought to be in America, the politics of happiness, politics of purpose, politics of joy. And that's the way it's going to be all the way to from here on out, unquote. By the way, the politics of joy was also Franklin Roosevelt's trademark, wasn't it? If Kamala Harris loses to Trump after sticking with her support for arming the slaughter in Gaza, historians will likely echo words from biographer Offner, who wrote that after the 1968 election, Humphrey, quote, asked himself repeatedly whether he should have distanced himself sooner from President Johnson on the war. The answer was all too obvious, unquote. That period for Humphrey was very, very stressful, and his career never recovered from it. He went back to the Senate. He was elected again, I forget when, in I think in 1972 or 1976. But it was extremely stressful for him. And eventually, in the late 1970s, he was a victim, of cancer. Of course, Johnson, through this period of time, also experienced extreme stress, and his heart wasn't able to take it. And I forget exactly when he died. It was 2 or 3 years after he left, the presidency. His heart, had always been weak. But I'm sure Humphrey's cancer had to do something with the stress that he experienced in the period from 1964 to that 1968 election. As I say, he came back to the Senate in the 1970s, authored one extremely significant bill, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill of 1979, which gave us the dual mandate of the Federal Reserve, so that they were made responsible not only for fighting inflation, but also for facilitating full employment at the same time. And we have Humphrey to thank for that bill. But boy, if Humphrey had won in 1968, the history of the United States would have been extremely different. It's very unlikely that Nixon would ever have become the president of the United States. It's very unlikely we would have had the Watergate affair. It's also very unlikely that the economics of the 1970s would have gone into the tailspin that occurred then due to the dual miseries of inflation and unemployment at the same time. I believe that Humphrey might have avoided those. Anyway, that was a very significant turn, in American history. This will be a very significant turn also if Harris should lose to Trump, because she sticks with supporting arming the slaughter in Gaza for too long. In a sense, then, the title of this article, is very, very appropriate. And it says, once again, is Hubert Humphrey's ghost stalking the Kamala? I think in more ways than one, in the coupling of the politics of joy, in her case, with the reality, of genocide. Real tough parallel. On that note, I'm going to end here, but I will look at your comments. Lana points out LBJ died in 1973. Right, and Humphrey died, I believe, in 1980, or 1981. He was younger than Lyndon anyway, but I don't know if he lived a longer life. Lana points out Humphrey died in 1978. Well, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill I believe, was passed in 1979, so I guess his name was carried on that bill, and maybe that's why it passed, in his honor. I don't remember the history that well then. Oh, Joe, I sent Bernie's DNC speech to your Twitter DM. But thank you, Lana. I think I've already seen that speech, but oh no, I couldn't have seen it because I think it was today, wasn't it? And I haven't seen the DNC today. I saw some earlier statements by him. Lana says, wow, this is a lesson moment, and are we repeating it? And the show, but Shomak Shooty says gold standard is still fiat, just fiat with a promise exchangeable amount of gold. That's correct, actually. It was fiat. Yes, of course it was fiat. No state has a Medicare for all health care plan. So how is it killing workers? Buck is Humphrey's grandson. I saw him at our state convention. Did you see what DNC party regulars did to Lauren Snyder and her group yesterday? No, I did not see. I take it they're demonstrating they're in favor of the Palestinians. Bernie just gave a speech that demanded a ceasefire at the DNC, lots of cheers, but they panned the audience, and I noticed plenty not applauding, and looking annoyed. Lana Dell says Humphrey of Minnesota. A lot of labor unions support Medicare for all here in California, or CalCare, yes. Robert says, Steve, I know about Darren. Robert, he is a troll. Yeah. So Darren says, Darren, what the bleep are you talking about? I disagree with Joe Firestone on more than one thing, but going against the Red Berets and Medicare for all is just plain stupid. Well, thank you, Robert. I appreciate that comment. I am on Medicare. So am I on Medicare. And Robert says, in your plan, dump the corruption will not work. Okay. I've gone over some of these comments, but I'll see. I'll pick up some others. Yeah, Darren is a troll, but so what? We can let him troll. It's not really a problem, is it? All we got to do is go past his comments and pick up the other non-troll comments. Humphrey of Minnesota, says Lana. Lana says, Bernie just gave a speech that demanded a ceasefire at the DNC. Lots of cheers, but they panned the audience, and I noticed plenty not applauding and looking annoyed. Yeah, the mainstream is always annoyed at Bernie, aren't they? Did you see what Lawrence Steiner? No, I did not see. I haven't been paying that close attention to the bullshit. I've been focusing on what I think are the real issues. And the Shomak Shooty does point out correctly that the gold standard is still fiat because the decision has been made by the government to use the gold standard. And that is a decision by fiat. So that is certainly true. But the point is, that the decision not to provide any backing from the currency at all, or any commodity backing for the currency, is what's meant by contrasting the post-gold standard period as a fiat currency period. Lana says, wow, this is a lesson moment, and are we repeating it? And Duck said, just tripped upon this. What are you guys covering? We are covering foreign policy. That is, look at the description under YouTube of what this was about. Darren Funzo has been trying to hijack the stream by talking about what we ought to do for labor. I, of course, am all for labor and care extremely for labor, but this particular stream is about foreign policy. And I have a perfect right to do streams on other subjects other than labor. Robert says, Darren, I fight to help the homeless population, tenants' rights, people on SSI, and single-payer health care, whether it be CalCare, or Medicare for all. Duck says, I just found this, and this Darren dude is annoying already. Well, it's a free country. Darren is just exercising his right of free speech. It doesn't really bother me. I'm not motivated to appoint people to throw him out or anything like that. Lana says they get thrown out of the convention. Same crap as 2016. Politics of joy, FDR, happy days are here again. And Steve GLI says, he says Hamas. Okay. Robert says, Darren, and organize people to support your causes right now. I don't think many people would support you with what I've seen from your comments. And Lana looked it up and said Humphrey died in 1978 and LBJ died in 1973. I didn't realize Humphrey gave us the Federal Reserve dual mandate. Well, Humphrey and Hawkins, yes. The Humphrey-Hawkins bill. Humphrey did do that. Humphrey was a great man, but tragic also. Are the Dems still supporting the genocide? Yes. Hawkins' bill to sue companies for workers was creative thinking. Yes, it was. And Steve G said, you got your bridge back. He said, good night, everyone. Steve says, K around the world, D and friends. Anna says, good night, D. And the Shobit Show, Makshudi says, IHS, the Indian Healthcare Service, is a single-payer U.S. healthcare system, just like the NHS. The IHS is the most efficient system in the States, just grossly underfunded. Yes. Yeah, just like the UK healthcare system is not as under. I think the IHS is more underfunded, than the UK healthcare system. But the UK healthcare system is underfunded too. This is Wesley Wiles. Hi, Joe. Hi, Wesley. Yeah, I think you've told me that before, but I had forgotten it. So I'm glad that you reminded me, Wesley. Lana asked, did you watch that great speech that Marianne gave yesterday? I sent you the link yesterday. Haven't had time to watch it yet, Lana. Lana says, hi, WW. Doug says, that's great of Bernie. May it be so. Wesley says, hi, Lana. No commodity backing would be characterized free-floating fiat. Thank you, Wesley. Free-floating fiat is correct. Lana says, I couldn't sit through the whole convention, wanted you to catch Bernie. Also saw Keith Ellison being interviewed. I know some of the folks from Minnesota who were there. They played a Prince tune for roll call. Labor needs to stop obstruction of single-payer health care. Some are on board, too many are not. Doug said, thanks for the explanation. Didn't think to read the description. I don't go on here much. Well, maybe you should come on more often. You can come on and read the description and then see what it's about. Our second airport terminal is named after Humphrey. The first K is Lindbergh. Doug says, I like your topics already. Steve G says, Israeli media admit that Israel, armed by the UK, US, EU, is intentionally sabotaging hostage deal talks and killing its own hostage. And not only that, they're working to widen the war as well. So that's what's going on. So I think we're through with the comments. Wesley says, it's Chickasaw. Okay, Neshoba is wolf. Chomak is tobacco. Shooty is pipe. Wolf and tobacco pipe. Okay, is Wesley Wiles. So thank you, Wesley. And Steve G2 says, oops, my PC's about shot. Laugh out loud. Now, my PC seems to be working pretty well tonight, I guess. Just lucky. Darren says, Darren is not a troll. His doctors told him to speak up. Okay, Darren. I'm not going to characterize you, okay, as a troll. If you refrain from characterizing me in a very unfriendly way, and if you refrain from characterizing me as having opinions that you have never heard me state. On that note, I'm going to say good night. I'll be back on Thursday. Okay, remember, I'm running on a constrained schedule right now, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, because I need time to do some business of other kinds. But there are 46 people here today, and I am quite pleased. Okay, with that, I need to do much to, lift my attendance. Those are 46 people based on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Oh, by the way, I have only 3 likes, so it would be nice if people gave this some more likes. I assume if there were 46 people here for most of the night, there's a potential for many likes. Solana says good night. And on that note, I will end this stream.